This beautiful bed and breakfast, it was unlike anywhere Aundria had ever stayed before. It was a charming white colonial house, complete with a wraparound porch and Adirondack chairs. And upstate New York was in fine form. Aundria could hear birds singing through the woods, and even the murmuring of a nearby creek. The people at this retreat were equally impressive. Aundria was just 19 and felt like a lost little puppy, insecure and out of place. But everyone else was older and seemed so competent and confident. And they all revolved around Dr. Henry, who had a rapport with everyone. Even the B&B owners greeted him like an old friend, telling him his special room was all ready and waiting. Aundria had noticed on the way in, Henry was driving a rusty old hatchback, which gave her a moment's pause. Wasn't he supposed to be really successful? She didn't think much of it. She'd heard stories about millionaires driving beat-up old cars to stay down to earth. And besides, everything about this retreat, everything about him, emanated success and competence. She was struck by how well Henry commanded whatever space he was in. He was like a king presiding over his domain, clearly affluent and highly intelligent. And beneath his New Jersey accent, he was very well spoken. He dressed well, too. Nice slacks and a crisp button-down shirt. And even his cologne was perfect. Maybe not something Aundria would want her boyfriend to wear, but for a man in his mid-40s like Henry, it only amplified his aura of maturity and authority. Aundria's boyfriend, by the way, he was the reason she was here. He was one of Henry's patients. In fact, everyone at this retreat was. And they all seemed to know each other, and they all looked to Dr. Henry as their leader and therapist. The group was impressive. Lots of professionals like doctors and lawyers. It felt as if Aundria was being presented with a whole different life, one she'd never been able to imagine for herself. Her anxiety escalated as the day went on, and she felt increasingly out of place. Everything was so nice and so foreign to her own experience, and she couldn't help but feeling like she didn't quite belong. Dr. Henry must have picked up on this while they were sitting near each other at dinner. She could tell he was very good at reading people. Before long, he started suggesting maybe they should work together. He had heard about her abusive childhood, her difficulty adjusting to life on her own, and he seemed confident that he'd be able to help her. Aundria sat there, surrounded by this beautiful and daunting new world, realizing that she was being invited in. What could she possibly say? Except yes. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories, and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist's chair. My guest today is Aundria Adams, author of the upcoming memoir, Wire Monkeys. Aundria grew up in a physically and emotionally abusive home. Her mom and stepdad would fight so violently that the police would show up at their door. Her father was as present as he could be during the weekend visits, but they grew increasingly distant as Aundria moved through adolescence. She'd seen what healthy relationships and loving parents could look like in her friends' families. But in her own home, she had nowhere to turn. So she learned to retreat inward, channeling all of the self-destructiveness that was being modeled for her. Once she was old enough to fight back, and after running away several times, Aundria was sent to live with her grandmother. She was 16 then, and for the first time, her home life was stable and supportive enough for her to focus on school. She knew that getting into college might be her best chance at escape. She found herself a bartending job to pay her way through college. And during her freshman year, she met a man who intrigued her. He was 8 years older than her, a grad student pursuing his doctorate in psychology. Dating him felt so grown up and serious, so different from anything Aundria had experienced before. Her new boyfriend spoke glowingly about a man named Dr. Henry, a psychologist he was seeing for therapy. And very early in their relationship, he invited Aundria to join him on a retreat in the Catskill Mountains that Henry was hosting for his clients. It struck Aundria as odd. Who goes on vacation with their therapist? But then again, what did she know? Her boyfriend was older and seemed to know so much more than her. And this psychologist was clearly a professional. So Aundria joined him upstate, along with all of those other impressive patients. And when Dr. Henry invited her to work with him, to join that family of patients, how could she not agree?
My first session, I was a basket case. I was a ball of nerves. I had no idea what to expect. His office happened to be in his house, which wasn't terribly unusual in the New York metropolitan area, but it didn't have a separate entrance. He was on the first floor of a very impressive brownstone. And when you walked into his home, you actually walked into his living room. And his decor was very ornate. He had large pieces of furniture, intricately carved. I remember candelabras and tapestries. It was almost like a museum to me. The odd thing is, he had these futuristic speakers in his living room with a maze of wires that covered the floor. And there was only a sliver of floor space to walk to the couch and sit down and wait for your appointment. So he was really into high-end audio. He always had the most lovely jazz or classical music playing, and these speakers made it sound like those musicians were in the room with you. I was so impressed by who he must be and how he affords all this stuff.
Aundria sat in that fancy living room, waiting for her session. There was a spiral staircase leading up to his office, and one patient would come down and the next would go up. When it was her turn, she spiraled up to the narrow office and found more fancy fixtures. There was an oversized leather couch with a matching armchair, ornate lamps with stained glass shades. It was honestly almost too over the top, like someone on a movie set had staged what they thought a fancy therapist's office might look like. But none of that was as striking as Henry himself.
Our first session, I remember, he was very impressive to me, where he could pull a lot more information and go deeper than my counselors ever had. And I remember feeling like he really knew what he was doing. This is a professional. This isn't some counselor. This guy is going to help me get better. So by the end of our intake session, he proposed that we needed to see each other twice a week because I had so much work to do. I said, okay, well, I have Blue Cross Blue Shield, so let's figure this out. And he said, well, I don't take insurance. He didn't trust insurance companies to maintain client confidentiality. I had to either pay in cash or checks written out to cash. So I felt like a gut punch because I'm a freshman in college. I'm paying my own college. How am I going to be able to afford this at $500 a month? I tried to negotiate down and say, I can only afford half. No, if you're really serious about getting better, you need to be here twice a week and you have to figure out how to make this happen. I was nervous because I was so worried about how I was going to afford everything. But I knew he was the ticket to me getting better. So I had to do whatever it took and sacrifice something or go into debt or whatever I had to do to get into treatment with this man. I felt this level of acceptance, like, wow, he wants to work with me. And he'd already known by that intake session that what I was missing. And he was very good at figuring out what people are missing and inserting himself as the solution.
Twice a week, Aundria returned to that nice brownstone and went up the spiral staircase to the leather couch. And she started getting to know the other patients who came before and after her. They were mostly older and were all really nice to her, which was reassuring. Here were these normal-seeming people who seemed to be here for reasons similar to her own, and they never treated her like she didn't belong. Plus, the sessions themselves were off to a good start, and it seemed like Henry might actually be able to help her. Soon enough, though, their relationship grew far more complicated.
The first incident that really jarred my intuition, and this is very early on in my therapy, I was going into detail about the abuse in my home, and I ended up getting quite upset and sobbing. And Henry stood up from his armchair, walked over to me, scooped me up like an infant under my legs, walked me over to his chair and put me on his lap and tried to console me. And my blood was on fire. This was so terrifying and traumatic to a girl who has never had love or affection in her entire life, for this man to come and do that to me. And I freaked out, for lack of a better term. I jumped out of his lap, and I can't remember what happened after that. If I stayed or if I told him I had to leave, I just remember feeling petrified. And he tried to console me and calm me down and explain to me that this was part of my intimacy issues and I needed to get used to people being affectionate with me. So I went home to my boyfriend and told him what happened. And he said, Henry's just weird and creepy and unconventional. I think he had good intentions. He just didn't know how to read you. So I don't know what he was up to, but I wouldn't leave therapy over this. Just give it another chance.
Aundria still wasn't convinced, so she went to a psychology professor at her school and told him what had happened. He basically said, does sound a bit unusual, but I'm not really one to get involved in other people's treatment. With everyone she asked, Aundria felt like her feelings were being invalidated, like that instinctual, visceral panic she felt said more about her than it did about Henry. But he had noticed her panic, and he seemed to take a step back and try a different approach that wouldn't scare her away. So their relationship continued, and she still felt like she was making progress. And he didn't try anything overtly inappropriate for quite a while after that day that he had first picked her up. So it was hard for her to notice the smaller, more insidious ways that he was making her dependent on him. He gave her just enough hope and confidence to believe that therapy was working, that she could get better, but not so much better that she'd ever try going out on her own. Aundria says it was like the slow erosion of water on a rock. Nothing too dramatic, just one little drop at a time, molding her into who he wanted her to be.
At one point, he ended up diagnosing me with a serious mental illness, and I was very disturbed by that. And I'd known what borderline was because my boyfriend was a psychologist and I would read his DSM textbooks. So I knew that wasn't good. But as long as I was in treatment with Henry, he assured me that I was going to be healthy and it didn't matter what my diagnosis was, and he was going to help me get better.
On one hand, we have Henry making Aundria feel validated and special, lavishing her with his attention. And on the other hand, he's convincing her that she is irreparably broken and would be helpless without him. She'd heard enough about BPD for that diagnosis to frighten her. How would this affect her work, her relationships? How would it shape the rest of her life? Way down the road, Aundria would consult with another psychologist who told her no way she fit the criteria for borderline. But at the time, who was she to second-guess Henry's wisdom? So his scare tactic had its desired effect. She needed him more than ever. Henry also started initiating more contact outside of the therapy office, like at restaurants or parties. And some of Aundria's friends, they took notice of this, including her best friend Emily, who explains it in this way.
She thought he was fabulous. She thought he was helping her in amazing ways. And me and some of her other friends around her were a little bit off-put by some of his behavior. He was a little bit too close. We shouldn't have met him. He would be at social events with me and her boyfriend at the time, and maybe we went to a concert in the city. Therapist should be a little bit distant from your personal life. I couldn't imagine that I would have met her therapist and hung out with him. It was very strange. It was a vibe. I couldn't explain it. Creepy feelings. My friends and I ended up calling him Creepy Henry. It was just weird. He was a little bit pretentious. I thought he was a bit pretentious. It was just odd.
Emily says they would be in group gatherings, and she'd see Henry just staring at someone, reading them, like he was trying to identify their weaknesses so he could pick them apart. And he had this haughtiness, too. Like he had all the answers, and he just wanted you to know it. After he started inserting himself in Aundria's life, Henry deployed his next tactic. This was to slowly sever her away from everyone outside of his sphere. And this is absolutely textbook with abusive therapists. He'd have her consider different relationships and essentially give her a choice. Either she needed them out of her life, or, I don't know, maybe they'd be willing to come in for therapy? If this is starting to feel a little culty to you, you're on the right track.
Any close relationships I had, I'd either be compelled to get them into treatment with Henry, or they were too toxic and I had to distance myself from them. So at one point, the majority of the people I spent my time with were people in the psychotherapy cult, his patients. Some friends of mine, I just told them, if you're not willing to get healthy, then I can't be your friend anymore. He had suggested that I get my father into treatment because he thought that was a relationship worth salvaging. And so I did. I'd recruited my best friend from childhood. She had started treatment with Henry.
So Henry had made the call. Aundria's relationship with her father was worth saving. And so Aundria reached out to her dad and asked him if he would be willing to meet with Henry.
I heard about Henry because Aundria asked me to see Henry. And at first I said no, I didn't need to. And she immediately broke down. I felt terrible about that. So I said, here I go again. I'm letting her down. So for her sake, I'll go see Henry.
That's Aundria's father, Donald. He says the two of them had grown distant over the years. Her adolescence was already tumultuous enough with her abusive mom, and Donald admits his shyness and lack of self-esteem at that point in his life, it might have felt like apathy to Aundria, like he wasn't actively trying to be there for her. He was a late bloomer in that sense. He could be relationally insecure and a bit awkward around people, but things were changing as he got older.
So before 40, I was this needy, low self-esteem person, very shy, hard to speak with. And then when I hit 40, I met my current wife, who's wonderful. I got my job, which I had a tremendous career with. My job forced me to be sociable.
So Donald was already on a good path, becoming more of the person he wanted to be. Maybe therapy could help continue that progress. And maybe it'd even help him reconnect with his daughter. It couldn't hurt, right?
Being honest about myself, my drawbacks, my social awkwardness, my low self-esteem. I thought about it. I go, maybe he can help me. And I call it the Bernie Madoff syndrome. Why did people invest in Bernie Madoff? They invested in him because everybody wanted to invest with Bernie. People that were highly respected, money people, professionals, they were dying to get involved with Bernie Madoff. So Aundria, she was dating this very intelligent man, and I respected him. And I said, this guy's really smart. And if he's seeing Henry, and Aundria is benefiting from seeing Henry, and Aundria wants me desperately to see Henry, okay, I'll give it a try. It was after it all fell apart and all was said and done that I realized I was involved in a cult.
Aundria joined her dad for their first session, which Donald says was really powerful and cathartic. He was able to apologize and take ownership for how they'd grown distant, and it was all very emotional.
That first meeting, we started our healing. He was crying during that session. I didn't see him as being a charlatan at that point. I couldn't pick it out. I didn't recognize it right away because he was genuinely moved by the session. Aundria was crying. I was crying. Henry was crying. We were all crying. I was kind of impressed. He's showing empathy, and I didn't see him as being a charlatan yet. After that session, we scheduled a follow-up session, and that's when he told me, he laid out the ground rules were, you don't miss a session. It's every week. This is how much it costs, and I expect to get paid whether you make a meeting or not. Very early on, I gave him my life, my weaknesses, my vulnerabilities, all in a nice, neat package, all wrapped up. And he knew how to push the buttons.
That last part is so key. Henry was very adept at reading people. And Donald's insecurities, his longing to be closer to his daughter, it made him a prime target. He even wielded privileged information about Aundria to help solidify their power dynamic. Did you know Aundria struggles with self-harm? He asked Donald. And the message was clear. I know your daughter better than you do. If you want to get close to her, you have to go through me. And by using excessive displays of empathy, like crying and showing intense emotional reactions during sessions, Dr. Henry makes clients believe he deeply understands and cares for them. And as a result, they trust him more, sharing more personal details and relying on his guidance. Henry knew he'd have no problem setting the terms of their relationship. He announced that they'd be having multiple sessions a week, and Donald would pay him whether he made it or not. When Donald said that that would be tricky since he traveled quite a bit for work, Henry said, that's fine. We'll just do phone sessions when you're gone. And, oh yeah, I only accept cash. Donald sees that as concerning in retrospect, but at the time, he wasn't really in a position to ask questions. Another red flag, he wished he'd noticed sooner how much Henry enjoyed bragging about himself. It seemed like he always had to be the smartest person in the room, and he wanted to make sure you knew it. He'd embellish his accomplishments, trumpet his credentials, and he loved showing off his record collection and fancy audio equipment. And by the way, did he tell you all the musicians he personally knew? Dr. Henry could see how much Donald needed validation. So he was very complimentary and told Donald how smart he was and how much he admired his honesty. These little self-confidence boosts felt good to Donald. So he didn't worry too much when their relationship started to look less like therapy and more like a friendship. Maybe therapists weren't normally supposed to hang out with patients at jazz clubs in the city, but who knows? Henry was the professional. But unlike a real friendship, only one of them was allowed to set the terms, to say when and where they should connect. One day, Donald got his hands on a new record collection, and he decided to call Henry about it. Maybe patients don't normally call their therapists on the weekend, but they were basically friends, right? So it'd probably be fine? Not quite. Henry exploded at him. How dare Donald intrude on his weekend? How dare he just call out of the blue? By this point, Donald had been groomed effectively enough that he couldn't reflect on the violent fragility in that reaction and how alarming it was. Right, he thought. Dr. Henry needs his privacy. I shouldn't have bothered him. And Donald wasn't the only one from Aundria's life who got sucked into Henry's incestuous little patient community. Her friend Emily started seeing him too. And remember, Emily's the one who called him Creepy Henry. But by this point, Aundria had been seeing him for a few years, and she talked all the time about how great he was and how much therapy had helped her.
She'd be like, oh yeah, you should go see him. Everybody has problems. Everyone can benefit from a therapist. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It's like, understood. Absolutely. I completely understand that, but I'm okay right now. 9/11 happens. Was living in the city, spent a year with a lot of anxiety having to commute into the same city that was bombed and just had an underlying anxiety for my whole life for quite a while. And I said, okay, this is really starting to affect my life. I think I'll give it a try. What can it hurt? I'll keep him at arm's length. I'm not going to invite him to my birthday party. I can handle it. I said, okay, better to talk to someone than nobody. She thinks he's helping her, so I'm going to go for it. I took a train to his home and just kind of sat and waited in a living room with nobody around, in a room that had books and bookshelves and some maybe college degrees, but nothing associated with psychology, psychiatry, or counseling, no certificates like you'd usually see in a medical professional's office. And I was just, hi, I have a master's in physics. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't related.
Emily was suspicious from the beginning, and so far nothing in his home/office was reassuring her. Then she ascended that spiral staircase, and her skepticism only grew from there.
He said, I don't take insurance. You could pay me in cash or a check made out to cash. And I was like, what? And he said, I don't advertise. Everyone comes to me by word of mouth, essentially because I'm so great. All of that is strange. Medical professionals should have advertising, easy ability to look them up, easy ability to verify. Cash or a check made out to cash is very weird. But I did it. I did it because you're vulnerable. I was in a vulnerable position. Okay, I'll hand this guy cash. We'll see what happens.
Everything about this was unsettling to Emily, but she decided to stick with it, at least for a little bit. Besides, she'd never tried therapy before, and Aundria had warned her it can be a little uncomfortable sometimes, especially starting out. Maybe this was all just part of the process. For the first couple weeks, she started to think maybe this could be helpful after all. Even just the chance to process what you're going through, being able to think objectively about your own life, maybe it was worth all of the awkward parts. Then later, as they were discussing her upbringing during one of those first few sessions, Henry declared that her mom had been abusive toward her. Let's just say, if this was his attempt to cut ties between a patient and the outside world, he chose the wrong person. Emily was indignant. Her mother was the furthest thing from abusive, and nothing he was saying rang true. And it wasn't just a simple matter of him misreading her story. He was clearly trying something, and it was not working with her at all. But therapy wasn't a complete dud for Emily, even with Henry. She felt like the handful of sessions were helping her get through an anxious low point, hopefully just a brief chapter of her life. And she trusted her ability to read the situation accurately, to know what was helping and what wasn't, and to know how much of herself to expose to Henry. But then something happened, and Emily was alarmed by her own instinctual response.
Incredibly strange things happened in those 5 or 6 sessions. I can't imagine what happened to people who were truly vulnerable. This is the occurrence that made me stop seeing him. I was living alone and I was making dinner for myself. I cut my finger with a knife and it was kind of a deep cut, but it wasn't something that needed stitches. What do? I panicked. I always have been a ferociously independent person, and something like that would not have caused me to immediately run to the phone and call my therapist. But I did. He talked me down. Oh, it sounds fine. I don't think you need stitches. Wash it out. Put a Band-Aid on it. You'll be okay. And I got off the phone and I was like, what just happened to me? I felt like a frog in a boiling pot. Why did I become that dependent on a human being? And I don't understand how it happened. It was 4, 5 sessions and it scared me.
A frog in a boiling pot is such a perfect metaphor. She didn't even know it was happening. But in some sneaky, invisible way, Emily had become dependent enough that she needed Henry's help to put a Band-Aid on. This was terribly alarming to her. She started thinking about all of the ways Aundria had become enmeshed with Henry. How sometimes it seemed like she trusted his judgment more than her own. Was he doing this on purpose?
That's when I went to my computer and I figured, okay, let's see if I could find a government list of licensed professionals. And I found some website that looked definitely official, maybe through the state. I couldn't find him. I couldn't find a license.
Emily decided to tell Aundria what she had found, or rather, what she hadn't found. She knew Aundria was much closer to Henry, and she didn't want to pressure her to leave him. It didn't seem like a matter of immediate danger or anything, but she did want to give her a heads up about her concerns. About how he didn't advertise and only accepted cash. About his baseless accusation against her mom. And about what seemed to be a lack of any official license. Aundria was too caught up in Henry's web, though. She couldn't see it at all with the same clarity.
My best friend only saw him for maybe a month or so. She had his number. She worked for the state at the time, and she looked him up. And she said, I don't see his license anywhere. And this is before the internet was this huge thing. She had to look up on this special government website. She's like, I don't see it. He's not registered in the state of New Jersey. And I said, his old therapist was in New York. So he's probably got his license in New York and he just lives in New Jersey. I didn't even think twice about that. I was so certain he was a legitimate psychologist because he was overseeing people's dissertations and all these people went to him and he was introducing himself as doctor. He just carried himself like a doctor. So it was beyond fathomable that he wasn't a doctor.
Aundria might not have shared her same concerns, but Emily was done. She stopped seeing Henry after just a handful of sessions. And by then, he'd probably realized as well that his tactics, they weren't going to work on Emily. Again, serial abusers and groomers, they're very skilled at sizing people up. And this includes realizing when their manipulations won't work on someone. It might be a matter of personality or not finding the right kinds of wounds to exploit. Whatever the reason, Henry was calculating enough to figure out who to focus on and who not to. Meanwhile, Aundria remained a prime target. Even after all of the enmeshment, all of the ways Henry pressured her into either cutting people off or bringing them under his control, he wasn't done exerting his will yet. Keep in mind that this was all developing pretty slowly, the steady dripping of water on a rock. But when you step back and look at everything, it's glaringly clear that he enjoyed establishing himself as a puppet master, learning which strings to pull to make everyone else do exactly what he wanted them to.
Henry, as he was pulling my relationships apart, over time would tell me, your boyfriend, he cannot give you what you need. After a while, I started to believe it and ended that relationship. At one point, I was introduced to Henry's right-hand man, a woman who was a fellow psychologist and my boyfriend's internship supervisor. This woman was also spoken very highly of. She was the most warm, wonderful, kind, beautiful older woman that I had ever met, recognized me. She was present in our conversation. She asked me questions and she said she was looking forward to getting to know me better. And at one point she pulled me aside and said, Aundria, I've never had a daughter and I'd always wanted a child. And you are just the most amazing young woman I've ever met. And I would love it if I could be your new mother. Yeah, I agreed to be her daughter. And it was really wonderful. She was so kind to me and invited me places and wrote me note cards. And I felt so loved.
After Henry pressured Aundria into breaking up with her boyfriend, Aundria's quote-unquote new mom, who we'll call Lucy, became even more involved in Aundria's life. She would call during the week just to check in, and she started showing up more often right before or after Aundria's sessions with Henry, almost like Henry had told her when to be there. Lucy was an accomplished woman. She was an author, a pianist, a military professional. Aundria was usually intimidated by such women. and she expected them to look down on her. But Lucy's warmth and affection, it was unlike anything Aundria had experienced before. And it felt so good, especially while going through a breakup. Of course, Aundria wanted her as a mother figure. She would only learn later that this too was Henry's doing. He was pushing the two of them together, encouraging Lucy to be more involved in Aundria's life.
So once I was out of that relationship completely alone and dependent on my social circle with the patient group, we would spend a lot more time together. To the point where I wasn't spending time with my family on the holidays. I was spending time with Henry and Lucy and some other patient group. We would go to Manhattan and go out to dinner. And Henry always had a reservation in the VIP section as Dr. Henry. He would show up and you knew who he was. There came a point where Henry started inviting me out alone. It wasn't with the group anymore. I know you're all by yourself. I'm going to a museum. Why don't you join me? And that made me nervous. One thing he would do was, in the beginning, he would give me a hug after sessions. Then it turned into a kiss on the cheek. And then it turned into him kissing me square on the lips. And that really jarred me. And he would tell me, you have such strong intimacy issues. You don't know how to be taken care of. You don't know how to feel loved. You're too busy taking care of yourself and everybody else. And I just constantly checked my intuition. Is this me? This feels wrong. Or is he making a pass at me? Or is this just me? It has to be me, because everybody in my life that I ask if he's being inappropriate tells me it's me. So at one point, I went and found another psychologist for a second opinion. And I said, all these things are going on with my therapist. I'm feeling very uncomfortable. I want to know if it's me or is this wrong? And this therapist asked me if I had a crush on my therapist. And maybe I had feelings towards my therapist. So it was me again.
Henry kept no session notes, no paperwork of any kind. And their time together, it started to look even less like therapy than before. He would confide in her about his own life, and he'd share detailed information about his other patients. These were people she had relationships with. Part of her knew this was strange, but that sort of special treatment, it only helped solidify her attachment to him, her sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Aundria would sit there and listen to all of this privileged information, every once in a while even offering advice, and it made her feel like she was part of some kind of special club. More and more, though, Henry continued dropping the facade of a therapist during their sessions. Instead of his usual slacks and button-down, he started wearing tight-fitting gym clothes. He loved bragging about how he had once been a renowned gymnast. So Aundria figured maybe he was just picking up a new workout routine. But then he started eating during their sessions and taking outside phone calls. And a few times, she even noticed his eyes would flutter and he'd nod off to sleep. He did some of these things with other patients as well. But they'd laugh about it together. Oh, that's just Henry being Henry. In some ways, it made them even closer as a group. Their therapist wasn't like other therapists. He was different, and that made him special, which made them special because he'd chosen them. And out of all of them, Aundria was the one he'd gossip with about other patients. She was the one he took on solo trips to fancy restaurants, classy museums, the VIP section at Broadway shows. And she relished his attention. But it unnerved her sometimes, too. Like the way he would occasionally kiss her. Was that just a European affection? Maybe something cute and grandfatherly? Or was it something entirely different? And the way he'd grow endlessly frustrated about Aundria's other romantic attachments. Like he wanted her all to himself. Aundria cared a great deal for him, but as a friend, and maybe even a father figure. But sometimes it felt like he wanted something more intimate out of her, and she did not feel that way about him. He was 30 years older than her after all, and everything was starting to feel too confusing and disorienting. This was increasingly true with Lucy also. Aundria loved having a new mom in her life, But sometimes it felt like she and Henry were conspiring against her. She would catch them in coordinating lies, and she kept getting the sneaking suspicion that they were working together to manipulate her. And she wasn't the only one. Donald didn't know everything that was going on with Aundria, how creepy things were getting with Henry, but he did eventually recognize how Henry and Lucy seemed to be working together as a team. Henry would encourage a patient to sever a relationship and then push them toward Lucy to fill the gap.
He always used to badmouth my current wife. There's not a better person. And he used to refer to her as an extreme narcissist. And then he would follow that up with a compliment or putting his business partner on a pedestal. So I'm looking back and I'm saying, this happens so regularly. Why do you badmouth my wife and then you're putting your business partner on a pedestal? Maybe you want your business partner to slip into that role.
On another occasion, Aundria confided in Lucy about some problems she was having with a guy she was dating. They were very intimate details, and Donald approached Aundria later using those same details to encourage her to break it off. It was only much later she realized that this was all Henry's doing, telling Lucy to get Aundria's dad involved so the two of them could keep their hands clean.
There was one instance where I was in his presence with Lucy, and he was just so happy that I had come and helped him after his mother passed away. And he had walked over to my car to thank me, and he grabbed my face and kissed me on the lips with Lucy in the passenger seat, looked me in the face and said, "We're going to take care of each other." And I started shaking. And Lucy looked at me as I pulled out of the driveway and said, "You know, Henry really loves you." And I just ended up feeling so confused. My intuition was on fire. I was lost. I started to feel insecure. So all this wonderful progress I had before morphed into this weird depression confusion. And it wasn't feeling safe to me intrinsically anymore. And the straw that broke the camel's back and was quite traumatizing, it got to a point where Henry's advances became too obvious to ignore. He ended up at one point, when I was doing his dishes at his house, grabbing my backside, and I ran into the bathroom and started crying. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't my intimacy issues. You are physically touching me. So I confronted him about it. And he, instead of talking through it or apologizing, he lashed out at me and made me feel like an insignificant nothing. And how dare you think that I would even consider you as a love interest? And that was when I said, I can't do this anymore. I ended treatment. Not long before that, I had proposed to my ad agency I worked for at the time to open up an office on the other side of the country. They approved it, and I just started a new life, started over.
After 6 years with Henry, this was a giant leap for Aundria. It was both scary and exciting. The first time she felt like she was actually taking control of her own life. Henry, of course, tried talking her out of it, tried convincing her that she would never make it on her own. But his behavior had grown so alarming that she was able to listen to herself instead, and she got out of there.
My father's still in therapy. I still have a decent relationship with my father when I left for Arizona, but he stayed in treatment for a while, and he was entrenched in this cult with Lucy. His perspective was that Henry was trying to pull him and my stepmother apart so he could set him up with Lucy. This is my father's opinion. Henry would be with me, he would be with Lucy, my mom and dad would be together, and we would be this unit.
On the other side of the country, Aundria's new life was off to a great start. Her career was taking off, she was making friends, and she'd moved into a beautiful new apartment. She was starting to feel like a real grown-up, fully capable of being on her own. But she did know that she still had a lot of baggage to work through.
I knew I was still screwed up. I needed help still. I needed a therapist. I wasn't turned off to getting better. Just because I had one screwed up one doesn't mean they're all screwed up. There had to be somebody that could help me because I was determined to live a good life. So I'd gone through quite a few therapists and eventually found one that I still have. We've been together for 20 years now. And he was the real deal. And as a guide, not as somebody who was telling me what to do and manipulating me, but as a legitimate therapist who wanted their patient to be successful. When I met my husband while I was in therapy with him, and I wanted to put in the work to be better and be the best partner I could be and the best mother, because I did want to be a mother at some point, and I sure as hell didn't want to repeat the mistakes of my own mother.
Aundria had fallen in love, her career was flourishing, and she was getting the help she needed. Her former life was fading into the rear view. Maybe someday her time with Henry would be just a weird story to tell at dinner parties. I was in a cult once, you know. But then things took a turn.
In the beginning of my marriage, I got a phone call from somebody I used to know back in the Henry days who said, the FBI called and I gave them your phone number because you'd been seeing him a lot longer than I had. He is in big trouble. He's under investigation, and so is your new mom. The FBI did call me. They flew out to Arizona to interview me and invite me to participate in his investigation. They informed me that he was a fraudulent con man. He was unlicensed. There were countless victims. My new mom and Henry had cooked up a scheme to defraud insurance companies because he did not have a license and she did. He was going to bill insurance companies under her license number, and she had agreed to it. So that's really why he ended up getting in trouble. It wasn't because he was a fraudulent therapist. In the end, I did find out there were so many victims who went through a lot worse than I did.
That last part there, the sheer number of victims, it was a surprise to Aundria's friend Emily as well, even if she wasn't exactly shocked by the scandal itself.
I was not surprised in the least. The one thing I was surprised about that so many other people were involved. You didn't have a giant group of people that you knew around him. He would have small, maybe siloed groups of maybe 10 people who knew each other here, and maybe groups of 10 people who knew each other there. But I didn't know that he had even seduced people.
It turns out this scheme had been going on for years. Henry was a con man, a serial abuser, and by all indications, a raging narcissist. Maybe there were easier ways to make a quick buck, but this particular setup allowed him to exert all the control he wanted to over other people's lives, making him the hero of all of their stories, with no regard to the damage he might cause. In some ways, Aundria was actually fortunate. She was only 19 when she met him, and she was young enough that she could start over. But now she saw that they were all just one of many, a means to an end, and every one of them replaceable. Then she saw a review from a newer client, a young girl who was singing Henry's praises just like she used to. Let me just pause here for a minute to point something out. When you're looking up reviews for a therapist or someone who has harmed you, don't let the positive reviews make you gaslight yourself. Abusers don't abuse everyone, and they often start grooming their fan base long before they start grooming their victim. So even after everything that Aundria had learned from the investigation and her own research, Aundria didn't have a sense of just how vast this scheme was until it went to trial. And she found herself standing inside of a packed courtroom. She had gotten to know a lot of Henry's other patients over the years, so she expected to see at least a few familiar faces. But out of everyone crammed into that courtroom, she only recognized one other person. There were so many other people there and so many stories of harm. What she'd seen firsthand was really only the tip of the iceberg. And Aundria wasn't the only one who was surprised. Her father, Donald, says before the investigation, he didn't know how inappropriate Henry had been with his daughter. Donald had quit therapy by this time, but not from any clarity about how abusive it all was, but because he realized it wasn't helping him. He could get more from talking with his friends, his real friends, or even just a good venting session with a barber. Plus, his relationship with Aundria was on a much better path, and that had been his main goal for therapy anyways. But the revelations of this trial and learning more about everything his daughter had been through helped him make sense of some of his own experience.
It was hard to fathom right away. I had to digest it. It wasn't like the curtain goes up and you're totally aware of how you've been groomed, how you've been scammed. I was scammed. It took me a while. After hearing what happened with Aundria, what happened at the trial, then I started going back. When you relive your life and all your sessions and all of the red flags that I missed, little by little, the puzzle pieces fell in that I was being groomed for a cult.
At the sentencing hearing, Aundria could practically see the resentment radiating off of Henry. He was supposed to be the best, the smartest, the one everybody else revered and depended on. How could they all turn on him like this?
Since it was insurance fraud sentencing, they had pled guilty. They knew the jig was up. The one thing that came up in the sentencing was he claimed to be a life coach. The judge had to tell him, you're not doing any more life coaching. We're done with life coaching. Just to see him there have to tuck his tail between his legs, knowing that this man who was always in control and held in such high regard was about to go to jail, federal prison. It was such a blow to his ego. As much as he apologized or pretended to feel a bit of remorse, I knew his personality. He hated every one of us for him being in that position.
Henry and Lucy both ended up serving prison time, but they were both out within a few years. Lucy had her license taken away, but when Aundria looked her up later, it seemed like she'd changed her name and had started working as a doctor at the VA hospital. But Aundria knows, even if there had been a more severe sentence, and as satisfying as that might have been, she still would have had her own healing journey to pursue. And she says the best revenge is proving Henry wrong, because it turns out she can make it on her own.
Given the right circumstances, anyone can be sucked into a cult. Here I am trying to be an advocate for therapy abuse, therapy harm, safe, ethical mental health treatment. In that circumstance where I was desperate for love and affection and broken from my home life, if I came across me now telling somebody, oh, this is what you need to look out for, this is how therapists should behave, I still would not have listened to me because the circumstances were that was a void in my life and I could trust those people. I wouldn't know who I was. The circumstances were just perfect to be sucked into this space. Everybody has a different situation. If all the pieces fall together, it could be you. So many people say, why did you do that? You should have been smarter than that. You don't even know it's happening until it's too late. My goal is to educate people, but everybody's going to end up going on their own journey.
Her father, Donald, agrees with this statement, and he wants people to know that anyone can be a victim of grooming. He's a very smart man and an accomplished food safety investigator for the government. But that doesn't mean he wasn't vulnerable.
And I hope this is going to help other people because it's a cautionary tale. As I said, I was an investigator and I was vulnerable. I could be duped.
I've said this before and I'll say it again. Grooming is not about a lack of intelligence or maturity or anything of the like. For Donald and Aundria, it was about particular insecurities and wounds aligning perfectly with a man who knew exactly how to manipulate them. Recovering from an experience like that and learning how not to blame yourself for being taken advantage of, it takes a lot of hard work.
I won't allow him to take up any more space in my life. He was an experience, not one that you seek out. I have learned so much of who not to be and who I want to be as a human being by being in an experience and surviving. That's your choice. You either sink to the abyss of the hell they create for you, or you rise above it and become the very best version of yourself.
I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to each of my guests today, Emily, Donald, and especially Aundria, for bravely coming forward to share your stories. Aundria advocates for patient empowerment and safe, ethical mental health treatments. She is seeking representation for her completed memoir, Why Are Monkeys?, about this experience. You can connect with her at her website, AundriaAdams.com. There you'll find resources for individuals questioning therapy and those interested in verifying their mental health professional's license. Follow her on Instagram at Aundria_Adams. That's AUNDRIA Adams. You'll also find links to connect with her in the show notes. Thank you also to the writer of this show, Bo Denton, and to our audio engineer at Peachtree Sound. If you'd like to connect with us or have your own story you'd like to share, you can reach out to us directly at podcast.psychotherapy@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time.